The doubters call it a plastic hip bath on wheels, a menace to all road users. Sinclair believe their C5, Britain's first mass-produced electrical car, will revolutionise town travel.
That was 1985 at the Sinclair C5 launch event at Alexandra Palace in London. 40 years on to the day, a group of C5 enthusiasts met up to celebrate the event and recreate some of the excitement. In what is now a lorry park, a concrete pad is all that remains of the pavilion, a temporary structure used to house events whilst the main building was out of action following a fire. And this is where the C5 launch event took place. Sam brought along his C5 depot stand to display some memorabilia. Alex brought along his C5 soapbox racer with improvised air brake, and a dozen other C5s and their owners displayed their machines. There was a great deal of interest from the press and television news, with crews from Channel 5 and ITV. We were joined by Sinclair Vehicles' one-time MD, Barry Wills, and Gus Debarras, who designed the C5's exterior, and I'll be chatting to both of them later in this video. Just like the launch day, journalists got to experience the C5 for themselves, and I think we got a very positive response from the television and newspaper reports, with many reflecting that the machine was ahead of its time and still looks futuristic. Sir Clive was compared to Elon Musk in terms of his visionary thinking and belief in electric vehicles, a far cry from 1985 when concerns about safety dominated the headlines, and the machine was compared to a bathtub. Later that day, Colin took his C5 to the Channel 5 news studio for a spin. Rob was interviewed for ITV News and discussed how he got his C5 and showed off some days out in the sunshine. But the soundbite of the day goes to Thomas for the following.
You just go out on a ride, middle of the day, and people wave at you, people honk at you. It's all good fun. You wouldn't get that with anything else unless you spend a lot of money. You get Ferrari attention for Fiesta budget.
I was also grateful to meet and to chat to two former Sinclair Vehicles employees. Gus Debarras, welcome to the Retro Workshop. Can you tell us what your involvement was in the C5 project?
Sure. I redesigned the body and all of the plastics, so everything that you see, effectively. Did it when I was 23.
Okay. And how did you come to be involved in the project?
I was hired by Clive to be his head of design for his electric vehicle company for my degree show in June. Started in September. And at the time they had a previous body style that Clive didn't think was right. And he was looking for minor changes, and I told him he needed to redesign it completely. And so that's what I did. From sketch through to clay, through to tooling.
Okay, and famously the body shell at the time was the largest piece of injection moulding, I think polypropylene at the time. Was there some challenges and some limitations in the design that you had to fulfill?
Yes, there are all kinds. For a start, I had to respect all the existing dimensions for where everything was, the handlebars, the wheels, and all of that. All kinds of clearances relating to feet. And then the tooling design, there was a tool designer, a lovely old guy called Nick Bibb, and he designed it so that it was going to shrink and be pulled off the tool, so it didn't actually need any ejectors in the tool. So I had to work with that. And the headlight, I couldn't change the headlight, things like that.
Okay, so there's some design constraints there. And what did you think of the finished machine?
Look, I was satisfied. It was a professional job given the brief. I had serious misgivings about the configuration, which I was very clear to Clive about, and I wasn't alone, about whether it was right for British roads was an issue. But really, there was no debating that. My job was to make it look right, and that's the bit I'm proudest of. We're still here today, and people look at it and they say, well, Elon Musk could have designed that last week. And that's my bit. So I'm quite proud of that.
Firstly, can you tell us your name and your involvement with Sinclair Vehicles?
Yeah. My name's Barry Wills, and I was the Managing Director of Sinclair Vehicles Limited.
Okay, and how did you come to be involved with Sinclair Vehicles?
I was introduced to Clive by a mutual friend of ours, a guy called Tom Carron, who, amongst many things, designed the Scimitar GTE, the Bond Bug, the Reliant Robin, and the Rally Chopper. And I'd known Tom because I was Deputy Managing Director of Reliant Motor Company at one time. And Clive had asked Tom if he knew anybody he could recommend as a possible Managing Director of his vehicle operation, that he was planning his electric vehicle operation. And Tom arranged for me to meet up with Clive, and Clive offered me the job of Managing Director on the spot with a very nice salary, thank you very much. Better than the one I had before, and that was pretty good. And I started almost immediately because I was actually between jobs.
And did you know what you were signing up to? I mean, did you know that the project was going to be the Sinclair C5, or had you got in mind something different, perhaps a car?
Well, Clive told me he wanted to do a car. And as a car man, you know, I worked in the vehicle industry for 50 years. I hadn't at that time, of course, but I'd probably done 20 years in the vehicle industry and put some pretty senior jobs. I had expectations of something a bit more car-like, let's put it that way.
Something with 4 wheels rather than 3.
Well, I did the Reliant Robin, so I'm quite comfortable with 3-wheelers.
3 wheels as well. And so, I mean, tell us a little bit about the project, because, you know, we're led to believe that the C5 was supposed to be a stepping stone to a full-sized, full-blown car. What were the plans for other machines beside the C5?
Well, Clive's expectations were that C5s were going to sell in high volume, and it would help fund 2 further vehicles. One that was termed C10, which was a 3-wheeled vehicle, 2-seater 3-wheeled vehicle with a single wheel at the back and 2 wheels at the front. A bit like the old bubble cars of the 50s, but obviously electric. And C15, which was a car about the size of the original Ford Fiesta, which is a lot smaller than the Fiesta of today, of course, with a, well, as that worked out, the expectation was it would have a sodium-sulfur battery rather than the lead-acid batteries that would have gone into C5 and C10. So there's a family of 3 vehicles growing in size towards a full-size car.
Okay. And how far did the development of these other machines get? Were they just drawing board stage, or any prototypes built?
It was drawing. No prototypes were built. It was drawing board stage. Yeah, Gus did some styling renditions of the C10. A guy called Harris Mann did some renderings of what C15 might look like, because Gus had gone off to do other work by that time. But I think I would have much liked him to come back and redo the C15, because he got a real knack of getting things right, and understood the philosophy, Clive's philosophy too. So that was the family of vehicles that were envisaged.
And so the C5 came along, and what were your first impressions of the machine?
Well, what I first saw was a very crude prototype that had been built by a guy called Tony Wood Rogers. Does that name mean anything to you?
Yes, sir.
He was Clive's right-hand man, based down in Exeter, who knocked up Clive's early ideas in all sorts of things, in some of his previous products too. And Tony presented Colin Spooner of Lotus and me with this contraption, which was without a body. It was a 3-wheel recumbent tricycle with an electric motor and battery. We took it to an airfield somewhere near Norwich, and frankly we wrecked it. That was after Clive had, I think, convinced Margaret Thatcher, who he was having lunch with most weeks at 10 Downing Street when she was Prime Minister. He came back one day after one of these lunches and told me about this new legislation that was allowing this electrically assisted cycle to be introduced, and this is what he wanted to pursue for his first vehicle. So all the plans for an electric car were pushed to one side for this new opportunity, which basically had been cooked up, I think, between him and Thatcher.
Okay, so that's very interesting. I was going to ask you, so you think the legislation didn't just come along at the right time for Sir Clive? You think he was actually instrumental in getting the legislation passed? Very interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's only me.
That's your reading of the tea leaves.
Exactly. I've got no evidence whatsoever. And I never asked Clive, I never poked my nose into what he got up to with Margaret Thatcher. All I knew was she was completely infatuated by him.
Well, he was obviously...
he got his knighthood around the same time.
I was going to say he was a great success in the fields of technologies, calculators in the 70s, and of course the home computer in the 1980s.
Yep.
And this was the sort of high-tech business that Mrs. Thatcher wanted Britain to excel in.
Get rid of the old stuff.
And get
close down British industry and get on with this new stuff.
The new computers. So yes, you mentioned his knighthood, which came around that time as well. So very interesting. So we think the legislation that allowed for the C5 may well have been cooked up by Sir Clive himself. Very interesting.
I think
just as an idea, perhaps.
He came back from a lunch with Margaret Thatcher to break the news to me.
Okay, very interesting. So without Maggie, we might not have had the C5.
You never know. Well, it was her government that introduced the legislation, of course. Yeah, sure.
So. What was your impression? So we talked to Gus earlier on, and he, had obviously helped to polish the design somewhat into the machine that we see today. What were your first impressions of the finished C5?
Oh, I was very proud of it. Everything was done very professionally. The design that Gus did was a very professional design. The engineering of the product that was undertaken by Lotus Engineering was done very thoroughly, and as a motor car would have been done. It met every bit of legislation that was known to man for car-like vehicles, and obviously for the electrically assisted cycle. There was legislation to be met there. So it was a very safe vehicle. This is where, the James Tye British Safety Council thing really, the pack of lies that they told, or he told, about the safety problem with the C5 that he invented.
Yeah, we'll come on to that because we'll talk about the launch shortly, Barry. So,
I get very worked up when I mention the name James Tye, of course.
Yeah, well, we'll come on to that. So back to the first impressions of the C5. I mean, you presumably had a go yourself in a C5 back in 1984 or 5. You jumped in, did you, and took it for a spin yourself?
I can't remember doing it. I had to demonstrate it many times. We had a lot of interest from people like, obviously Hoover wanted to see it and try it, because they actually volunteered to manufacture whatever it was that Clive Sinclair was developing, and they did the deal with them. The Electricity Council, Comet, the retailer, all these people came in, signed confidentiality agreements, and tested the vehicle indoors. We'd got quite a large premises at Warwick University Science Park that we were based at, and plenty of room to drive around in that without taking the vehicle outside. So yeah, and everything was favourable. Everything was favourable until launch day. News.
Launch day, let's fast forward then to launch day.
Yep.
So it was all looking good for the C5, and launch day came along, January the 10th, 1985. Here we are at Alexandra Palace, exactly 40 years to the day later. So cast your mind back to 1985 and what unfolded. Tell us about the day.
Well, the launch itself went extraordinarily well. Alexandra Palace was built as a track, with an oval track, with a central plinth, with Clive and myself standing there, watching the girls driving the C5s burst out of cardboard boxes halfway round the track, and then do a circuit ready for the TV cameras. And because everybody was, all the TV was there. There was a grandstand built for the press. There must have been 200 press there, journalists, I would say. Clive very carefully threw the field open for questions from the press and nominated me to answer them. So I found myself confronted with this 100 or so press, and the very first question came from a young man called John Humphreys.
I remember him.
Of the
BBC.
Today programme fame.
Okay, yeah.
Remember?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he hadn't honed his evilness at that stage of his career. He was quite gentle with me. But John, the very first question, I'll never forget it, was asked by John Humphreys. And it all went well. You know, there were lots of questions asked. They all had to go. It must have taken a good half an hour or so to get through it all. And then came the big mistake. We allowed the journalists to drive around the track
Within the confines of the conference
within the
centre,
confines
right?
of the
In the
original building.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
But 2 or 3 of them found a way out. And once that 2 or 3 had found a way out, they all found a way out. And of course, Alexandra Palace on top of a hill on a cold winter's day in January was not exactly the best venue for testing C5s outside. So it was all a bit of a farce. So most of the journalists were finished up dragging their C5s back up the hill on their back.
And just for the benefit of the viewers, the challenges being C5 likes the flat, not so good on a slope, and of course the old lead-acid
batteries don't like cold weather.
Don't like cold weather. And just as today, when it was -4 degrees when I got up this morning, back in 1985, there was snow on the ground.
Snow on the ground. It was even colder, I would suggest. But I was a young man and I didn't feel it.
Yeah, so the C5s are taken out by these wily journalists escaping through the fire doors, only to find that outside of the confines of the warm, flat conference venue, the C5s were struggling.
Well, they got down the hill all right. They got down to Muswell Hill or whatever it is at the bottom of the hill.
They went quite far, did they?
Oh, yeah, they went off all over the damn place.
So it wasn't just within Alexandra Palace.
Oh, no. They were on the roads everywhere. They were all over the place, including Stirling Moss. He was one of them. Yeah.
Fantastic.
It was amazing, yeah.
So, and of course, the journalists probably would have, worked well. As we know, there was not such a favourable write-up. And you mentioned a self-styled safety advisor who also had some critical comments about the C5. Tell us about this
critical
individual.
comments is an understatement.
Tell us what was said.
Well, just let me give you a bit of background. James Tye was his name. He ran an organisation called the British Safety Council, which sounds like it's a government entity, doesn't it? You know, it's some official British government entity. Well, it wasn't. It was just a company he'd formed on the back of the health and safety movement that was beginning to take off at that time. And he was selling leaflets and courses on health and safety through his company. And he was a headline grabber. He grabbed headlines, for instance, for criticising the Queen for riding a horse with just a a scarf on her head, not a safety helmet. Criticised Princess Anne for allowing her then young children for riding ponies without safety helmets on. That's the way he would grab headlines. Well, of course, unfortunately, he got a journalist's licence. So he turned up at the launch as a journalist.
Had a press pass or something like that?
Had a press pass,
right,
yeah.
Okay.
We didn't know. And of course he had a ball. And ITV and BBC main news that night showed the launch, but mainly consisted of James Tighe telling the world how unsafe this vehicle was, how 14-year-olds should not be allowed to ride it, and there would be deaths all over the place. That's the damage that he did on national television, on prime time, 10 o'clock news, you know. And then, of course, the press jumped on the bandwagon. We had about 2 days of decent press, because most of the press who, despite what had happened with the batteries and the vehicles failing, the press were very kind. For 2 days, and then they started to jump on the James Tighe bandwagon, and the press turned completely, and it effectively killed us stone dead. Electricity Council pulled out. They were going to sell C5s through their showrooms. Comet stayed loyal, fortunately. They were very good. Hoover stayed loyal because they had obviously a lot invested in it. Yeah, a lot of people just ran.
Now, another factor, though, that likely affected C5 sales was the fact that I'm a C5 enthusiast, Barry. I love the machine.
I know you got it on you.
I've got it on my branded fleece here, but it's definitely a fair weather machine. It's great in the summer. It's great on a summer's day, and yet here we are in the middle of winter.
I'll give you a Bill Nichols quote, right? Yeah. Summer, wonderful, winter, bad. That's not the exact wording. The exact wording's in my book. which are in the car. But yeah, that's the that's it. Yeah, the original launch date was going to be June. That was my launch date.
Right.
Clive wanted it pulled forward to January because he wanted cash flow.
Right, so
he wanted to start getting a return on his investment.
So money was getting tight within the firm. You spent a lot of money.
Not in the firm.
Oh, okay.
No, money wasn't getting tight in the firm at all. No, we were well funded, okay. But Clive wanted to get a return on his investment.
So it was Clive wanting to get something out of the business.
He wanted to see some money coming in so that he could take it out in dividends, because he was 100% shareholder of Sinclair Vehicles Limited.
Okay, so the pressure came from Clive to bring it forward from June. The original planned
the original planned date, June, was pulled forward to January.
Okay, so we...
The rest is history.
Brilliant. What are your reflections on the C5 project?
My reflections are of a project very well done. The whole thing was done very professionally. The design by that young man over there was done exceptionally well. For a young man straight out of the Royal College of Art, never worked in his life before. Lotus Engineering was done well. Hoover were superb assemblers of any product that, had got a plastic housing, an electric motor. They were familiar with that type of thing, developed a superb assembly facility for it. So everything was done well. The launch itself, 40 years ago today, was also very professionally organised, very well done. I got a feeling of pride that what Clive asked me to do was done well. Unfortunately, what Clive asked me to do was wrong.
And just going back for a moment to the British Safety Council chap who said that this thing was a death trap.
Yep.
I mean, I don't know of anyone that's ever died in a Sinclair C5. Do you?
And I think I would have heard if there'd been any reported injury even. I've heard of some drunks who use it to drive back from the pub, because they didn't need a license for it. That's about the only criminal activity or anything of that type that I've ever heard. But certainly no major injury, no death.
Great.
No.
And in terms of the machine itself, obviously today here we've got a following of enthusiasts.
Yeah,
but,
very impressive
It always strikes me that whenever you see people who either are aware of the C5 or are not, it brings a smile to their face.
Yes, it does.
It never fails to bring a smile to their face, and that's something nice, I think.
Yeah, not laughing at it, they're enjoying it,
Yeah, no, I mean, genuinely, as I was saying to Gus earlier, or I think a lady earlier, you've been stopped by young people who don't know what a C5 is, and they say, hey, that's sick. Now I have to translate, Barry.
Yes,
that's young person speak for, that's really cool, that's great.
Despite my age, I've got a son who's only 30, so I've grown up with that.
Yeah. So, it still certainly turns heads and brings a smile to people's faces. I mean, I enjoy it tremendously. It's certainly a fair weather machine, not one for a -4 degree day like today.
You're telling me.
But I very much like to thank you for your contribution.
Well, it was a pleasure then and now. Thank you.
And if people are interested in learning a little bit more about the C5 and your extensive career in the vehicle industry.
Yeah, there is a book, 45 plus years without John DeLorean, that is on sale through a website. If you Google my name, Barry with an IE, Wills not Willis, you can find me, and there's a way in which you can purchase the book through that. My first book, which was about my time with DeLorean, is a sellout, so unfortunately that's no longer. People are advertising it at ridiculous prices on eBay, which I certainly wouldn't pay, but whether they ever get money for them, I don't know. But anyway, the second book is the one with the fairly long chapter telling the whole Sinclair Vehicles story from a guy who was there from the start to finish.
Well, Barry, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today.
My pleasure.
And all the best.
Thank you very much indeed.